Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you this evening to Cal Poly's LA Metro Lecture Series. Hello, students, and Stephen Phillips. I want to welcome Zeina and John. Thank you both so much for being here. I know how difficult it is for us to just be on another Zoom call as opposed to the Design Center, which is where I'm floating. So sorry for the, choppy head and all of that stuff. For those of you who don't know anything about Helms, it is a historic landmark building built in 1931 when it was an actual working bakery. And they would deliver baked goods throughout Los Angeles. And since the early 70s, when the Marx family purchased the property, they began a loving restoration and reimagining to what it is today, which is a hub for art, architecture, and design events, for wonderful partnerships like we have with Cal Poly and Stephen, where we bring you sort of a slice of Los Angeles in all of those spaces. So if you're interested in events like this, which I'm sure we all are who are on this call, you can sign up for a newsletter and you'll see what's coming up in the future. We are probably about to embark on some in-person events very, very soon. So thank you all for being here, and we appreciate your time. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen so he can introduce John and Zeina. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Angela. It's always terrific to be supported and have these opportunities to work with you in the Helms Bakery District. We do miss our lectures there at that wonderful space, but we look forward to that coming up. It's an event coming up in June that we'll announce in a while, but also then next year, yay. So very excited to have John and Zeina here with us to speak to our students. We are, I'm Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly Los Angeles Metropolitan Program in Architecture and Urban Design. We're part of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. We're a fourth year off-campus program here in Los Angeles, where you can see in the room our 36 students who are interning in offices all over the city, as well as taking studio, history, theory, and practice classes. I see some of our faculty, Joanna, and I think I saw Teddy there, and Pavel also is teaching with us. It's a really great team of people. We have a fantastic group of students, and we definitely have enjoyed this sort of special part, which is our lecture series. I just want to, of course, put out a little thank you to our sponsors, of course, the Helms Bakery District, HMC Architects, Morphosis, Boltaup, Theater DNA, Co-Architects, AC Martin, Arc Reprographics, who've all been very supportive and wonderful to us along the many years. I'm really excited that we have Zeina and John here today. It took us some effort to get it all to coordinate. It's been an extremely intense year for everybody. And we're just very grateful that we're maybe hopefully coming out the other side and things are maybe looking up for a great change. So Millions is a Los Angeles-based experimental design practice founded by John May and Zeina Koreitem. Millions conceives of architecture as a speculative medium for exploring the central categories of contemporary life, technology, politics, energy, media, and information. Their approach insists on an expansive parallel project of technical, historical, and cultural analysis, which surrounds and informs their work. I've met John often at GSD, mostly in his reviews with his fantastic students, and he's been very, very cordial to let me participate in those. And he's also become a major force within the history theory world, as has Zeina joined in with the office and their production. So it's really great to see that combination working together. And so always been very supportive of that. Millions' work has been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions, including a commissioned furniture set by Friedman Benda Gallery, New York City, and Chamber, a commissioned display system for the Taipei Biennial, shows at La Triennale de Milano, sorry, my Italian, the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, the Architecture and Design Museum of Los Angeles, the MIT Keller Architecture Gallery, and the Harvard Graduate School of Design, among others. Recent work includes completed and ongoing projects in California, New York, Boston, Taipei, and Beirut, Recently, they were selected as the winner of the international competition to reimagine the East Wing of I.M. Pei's Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, which is fantastic, and to restore other aspects of the museum. Zeina Koreitem is a registered architect in Beirut, Lebanon, and design faculty at SciArc. John May is assistant professor of architecture at Harvard University Graduate School of Design and author of Signal Image Architecture, Columbia 2019, and Design Techniques, Archaeologies of Architectural Practice, Minnesota Press, 2019, co-edited with Zeina Selleck Alexander. Anyway, please join us in welcoming John and Zeina. We're really looking forward to a fantastic lecture. And please stay for a Q&A afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen, for that introduction. I think Zeina's we're in different cities right now. Zeina's gonna share screen, and there may be some moments where she and I have to communicate about who's driving. But Zeina, if you want to go ahead. So many thanks to Stephen and Cal Poly Metro, and also to the Helms District for hosting us. Of course, we would have preferred to be there in person, but we're more than happy to give the lecture tonight. As Stephen said, it was sort of a long time coming. We were originally intended to give this lecture at this time last year, and the world just didn't seem like the right place at that time. And as Stephen said, hopefully now things are beginning to look up, and we can all look forward to being in the same room again someday. We're going to run through a series of projects. We'll start with a few older projects from several years ago, and then of course we'll build up to more recent ones, in particular Taipei, and we'll finish with the most recent work on the Everson project in Syracuse. So go ahead, Zeina. So really Zeina and I began working together in I think 2012, and like any sort of young office at that time, most of our work was highly speculative, and we sort of began to conceive of projects that would serve as vehicles for asking a lot of the kinds of questions that we're interested in, as Stephen said, not just architectural, but historical, cultural, technical questions, and the relationship among all those things. I mean, for us, architecture is a very synthetic act, and it involves thinking through all of these different categories of life at the same time and trying to navigate them. So a very important series for us early on was this project that we've called the Collectives, which is actually still sort of going on. It's maybe it'll be an endless project. Maybe we'll do it forever. We're not sure, but it involves asking a series of questions about contemporary culture, and ironically, far prior to any pandemic, sort of the condition of modern loneliness, and whether we might begin to sort of in a very non-nostalgic way engage with some of the questions that the original project of social housing, modernist social housing, undertook in the early 20th century. So questions about communality and collective life. But we wanted to do that in such a way that was contemporary, and that asked also questions that maybe were not relevant or pertinent a century ago. Images like this have always been, when we first met, these are images that were very important to us. We see an image like this, and we see a sort of fully blown architectural object that is a typological invention that came out of a very rigorous understanding of the relationship between space and form and life. And ultimately what we see is there are sort of lives being lived out together here, of course, on the roof of the Unité, and collective events. And we've gone to these projects and spoken with some of the older residents who have lived in those projects for a long time, and they speak very fondly of their years there. So these are things we're interested in, and in particular as a kind of critique of this atomization that has occurred in our time, in our lifetimes, which we might call like the condominium or the bachelor apartment, in which everyone has their own sort of individualized, what Peter Sloterdijk has called egosphere, where your primary relationship is with yourself or with some other narcissistic individuals you may be sharing your space with. So we're wondering, in our time, the collectives has been a way for us to ask, in our time, what would it mean to live differently than this, and what would it mean to collect spatially in different ways. Just methodologically, as a word, we do a lot of sort of like just digital sketching, thinking through the relationship in here between facade profiles and sort of internal cellularization. If you go to the next one. A lot of quick animations along the way for understanding different scales of cellularity within a project. I would say within the collectives, we're taking on the three major typologies that we received, that architecture received from this sort of really intense period of modernist invention, typological invention. So what we in the office call the bar, the tower, and the carpet. This, obviously, you're looking here at the tower and the question of high density living. One of the things we wanted to do in these projects is really question all of the underlying premises. Like for example, in this case, what would it mean to have highly inefficient circulation as opposed to efficient circulation in a tower? Would that stimulate different forms of interactivity or of interaction and sociality if you didn't simply move efficiently from a lobby into an elevator and then down your hallways into your own individualized homes? Sketches like this, animations like this, is a way of thinking through a kind of Raumplan and relationships that are much more volumetric. Laced into this whole set of experiments are ideas about thermal mass and the way in which, and these are things we've written about in some of our essays, the ways in which a different approach to temperatures on the interior might lead to far less static designations, programmatic designations. And so one of these series, for example, we were calling it Collectivity After Program, the way in which you might begin to move around and we posit a certain kind of like climate. Obviously, we're in Los Angeles, so we're thinking about a certain kind of Southwestern climate or Mediterranean climate where you have very hot days and cool nights. And how does that interface with a kind of the day and night oscillation of air temperature versus surface temperatures? And how might that change how people occupy architectural objects and interiors? Here you're just seeing some of that kind of that Raumplan volumetric connections that allow for continuous airflow vertically and the kind of buoyancy effect of the stack effect. Keep going.
And I might add excessive circulation as well.
Yeah. These are, we're always trying to, I think in the office, come up with ways of, on the one hand, of course, we're locked into using a lot of very conventional forms of architectural representation, a lot of orthographic plans, sections, elevations as a way of not just communicating, but increasingly as a way of building projects. But we always want to have other methods that actually very productively undermine those more conventional categories of plan, section, elevation. So these are these kind of very simple CNC 4-axis horizontal slices that are simultaneously plans and reflected ceiling plans at the same time. So there are these sort of volumes that we will then fill or we will cellularize later. So we did horizontal studies, and then we did a series of kind of vertical studies looking at what might happen if you take the kind of typical atrium and begin to play with its profiles. The kind of very simple rearrangements of the profiles on the top and the bottom, which lead to all kinds of different interior conditions. These are sectional studies, obviously. What resulted was what we called like a whole series of possible plans, which we then stacked. And again, as soon as you remove the mandate of efficient circulation, of course, these are speculative projects. If anything like this were to ever be built, we'd have to do all kinds of work to bring it up to code in some ways, but maybe less work than we might first imagine. Keep going, Zeina. Here's a series of those. seeing the cellularity and the relationship between the atrium, which really is the primary motive. That's really the primary sort of ventilation stack for bringing in all kinds of natural air. And a lot of this was in consultation and in sort of in conversation with our friends Keel Moe and Salman Craig, who are now at McGill, who are really some of the more radical thinkers right now in the field around energy issues. This is really the first project that we showed publicly. So this was at an exhibition at MIT, the Keller Gallery at MIT in 2014 or 15, I can't remember. These are just more images from that exhibition. In these, you're seeing that the facades themselves are just expressions of that they're essentially extruded back from the profiles that were used to carve up those masses and then placed in combination. And then, yeah, the next one is as part of that, we published a small catalog with a lot of sort of polemical ideas about collective living and housing. And I mean, we pretty much make everything we write. Pretty much everything we write is free on our website. So if you're interested, it's there.
So the next project that we'll talk about is the Beirut rooftop. And I see that some of you guys have images as your backgrounds. So the previous set of experiments that John talked about is essentially a kind of, let's say, proto-architectural experiments in the office, that they are projects that usually we refer to them as such, and they ask more expansive questions around social, political, cultural, historical, and as John mentioned, also thermodynamic questions. Questions about habits and routines of living, about contemporary domesticity, the possibilities of collective living in our time, but also questions about ways of working and ways of producing formal and sort of solids within our workflows. So what you saw in the previous project is what we've been referring to in the office as computational solids. So they are objects in some ways that are trapped between data and materiality. On the one hand, they are kind of a list of coordinates, and then on the other hand, they also have to adhere to limitations of the limitations and possibilities of a specific material block. In the previous project, the block would be the EPS foam, and then the limitations of also a process, which is the CNC 4-axis wire cutter that John mentioned. These experiments continued within the same vein. And this idea of, or this notion of digital solidity and digital subtraction kind of continued in the Beirut rooftop as well. So how do these experiments play out with notions of program, scale, and tectonics? When we were approached to do this project, the project actually in Beirut was in 2 phases. So the first phase was a renovation, a simple restoration renovation of an existing building. The second phase was meant to be an addition on the rooftop of a bedroom, a kitchen, and a studio. So the project allows us to test some of the ideas around thickness, thinness, and thermodynamic considerations. We question the idea that in a modern domestic interior, rooms are typically or were typically assigned and designed according to their functions in the cycles of everyday life, and that in general, those room assignments like bedrooms, living rooms, bathrooms, etc., did not change day to day. And these thermal questions became a way for us to challenge in some ways this static programmatic property of a home. And we became really interested in the idea of thermal vacillation and variable wall thickness that can replace standardized width of walls and also allow us to produce a program or propose a program that is less static and more dynamic and where rooms are shifting. So we began to explore this idea of what we refer to as unprogrammed architecture in a single family setting, in which new habits might emerge out of the changing thermal conditions of day to day and season to season. And of course, we're dealing with a Mediterranean climate in Beirut, not too different from the California climate actually. So in reality, this approach really depend on this climate, but also when we studied historically how modernist, let's say, domestic spaces were laid out, we realized that they depended secretly upon mechanical regulated interiors, so HVAC systems, which provided a blank canvas on which the architect could assign rooms with little or no consideration for energy consumption sequences. So we became interested in working again with thickness and poché and a kind of round plan, a Lucian section. Service and storage spaces became embedded in that thick northern wall section, while the southern facades were cast thin to minimize solar exposure on the thermal mass. So from the beginning, this project was driven by producing a single communal space under or beneath a large ceiling, where rooms were packed above. So the reflected ceiling plan became again a driving instrument in this project, and the geometry or the curvature of the ceiling also emerged from a specific process with the CNC 4-axis wire cutter. And again, the strategies of the Ramplan, like masses above, became a way for producing continuous airflow between volumes and the kind of spatial effect we were interested in. We speculated that the entire mass would lag several hours behind the natural cycle of day and night. In basic terms, the internal and surface temperatures of the thick concrete essentially will lag several hours behind the ambient air temperature in these climates, which is again very similar to how we live here in Topanga. Surfaces remain cooler for longer periods during the daytime, but they radiate warmth in specific zones during the night hours. So this is what we began to refer to as a delayed oscillation, which produces zones of cool and zones of warmth in various parts of the project. And these zones, they start to kind of invert and across the plan. We produced a sectional model for an exhibition in Los Angeles at Giant Jai Gallery. And here what you're seeing is actually a sectional model that is tipped up minus 90 degrees, so in the x-axis rotation. But you begin to see in this initial kind of test, let's say, ideas around packing of rooms, Lucian organization of a section as a main kind of spatial and organizational technique for this project. And this was a 3D sand print, large, about 30 inches by 20 inches.
So, I mean, there's other projects that sort of sit in that same family. I mean, Zeina's worked a lot on a series called Projectors, which you can kind of see over her shoulder, which are these sort of like proto-architectural experiments, but all of those belong maybe to a kind of like certain family of experiments that, like as Zeina said, belong to kind of like computational solidity in a way. As you know, I mean, of course, there's many people working on this, but it's a question in our time, like what does it mean to call something solid anymore? At the same time, we were also, or let's say at the tail end of those, we were increasingly interested in, so this is a scene from Zabriskie Points, from Antonioni's Zabriskie Point. It's the kind of like, it's the culmination scene at the end of the movie. We were just really captivated by this scene. We were rewatching a lot of his films a number of years ago, and it seems to, on the one hand, it's this sort of explosion of consumerism, but on the other hand, there's something so delicately choreographed or seemingly choreographed, and we wondered. Of course, this is in film. That none of this was done digitally, but we wondered what it might mean to think about the digital as something that can have a kind of looseness or a carefully calibrated looseness to it, and maybe these notions of precision and approximation, or precision and looseness, don't have to be antonyms. Maybe they can almost be brought, maybe not completely as synonymous, but they could be brought in proximity with each other. So at the same time, the same time we were sort of like beginning to obsess about this, we were approached by Chamber Gallery by Juan Garcia Mosqueda for a show he was curating at Friedman Bender Gallery in New York. Zeina, do you want to advance it?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna add, so we will talk about a series of projects next that are, that belong to this kind of family of thinking around collections, and more specifically, loose collections, as John mentioned, that how can looseness be precise, and how can precision be approached with looseness and vice versa. And so the next series of projects, so the first one being Bathing Again, we'll also talk about the Milano Triennial, and we'll talk about the Taipei project in the biennial as well this year. So these three projects belong to this family that deal with these questions of looseness. John, do you want to?
Yeah. So this is a project. This was as a furniture commission. We were approached to basically produce a furniture set for a show that would be at Friedman Bender. And at the time we were approached, we'd spent a couple of years looking at sort of being fascinated by bathing culture, by especially pre-modern bathing cultures, but also certain contemporary bathing cultures. Obviously, prior to COVID, we were regularly would go down to K-Town, to Koreatown, and go to the amazing spas that are there. But of course, whenever we travel to Beirut each summer to visit Zeina's family, we would travel around and look at Ottoman bathing culture and a whole series of other pre-modern bathing cultures. So that was kind of on our brain. As you look into the history of bathing, what you realize, it's only in the last roughly 100 to 150 years, it's within a century or a century and a half, that this act called bathing, which used to be this highly extended, meaning in its time period, an extended period of time, and a highly social activity, was drastically and very rapidly, rather suddenly, transformed into an activity that's meant to be produced in a very short period of time and isolated, alone. So looking at that, you can find a couple different reasons for that. One of them is of course the invention of the wet wall, as a kind of standardized building technique, whereby something like bathing furniture became affixed to a single wall and became fixtures. This began to set the relationship within the sort of modern hygienic bath, the contemporary apartment or apartment building bath or domestic bath. The other thing is the one-sided cast porcelain tub, which tended to set the minimum dimension of a typical bathroom, such that by the second half of the 20th century, bathing, instead of being this sort of long extended social activity, at least within many westernized cultures, had become a kind of highly efficient act of self-care, and in which one's primary relationship was not with other people, but was with one's own self-reflection. So we wanted to question that. We noticed that in a lot of pre-modern cultures, and again, even in some non-Western modern cultures, a lot of the elements were in the round. They had a kind of three-dimensionality to them in plan. That this very subtle move of detaching the act, the kind of routine of bathing from that single wall and allowing it to have a kind of spaciousness around it, we imagined that maybe that would have the ability to kind of produce different forms of sociality and relationships. Keep going, Zeina. So these are some like initial sketch plans where we're proposing three elements: a wash basin, which, and again, all of these operate on a kind of thermal mass principle. So it could either be a wash basin that has hot water if it's a cold day, or it could be, or vice versa. Also, these large radiant slabs, which would have radiant heat in or cooling in them, and then a bathtub. But we wanted the bath in every one of these cases. It was meant to be social. These are some initial models. Well, these are some models along the way as we were developing the final piece. You can keep going then. Yeah. So rendering. So this is the wash basin. the tub. So ultimately we only materialized or realized as part of the show the sort of floor plates, the lounging plates, and then the wash basin. And the wash basin is a 800-pound 3D silica sand print with a kind of marine polymer finish that seals it. And then we also were really interested in this question of the relationship between the color white and hygiene. And so we wanted to also produce something that sort of very subtly destabilized that relationship in your mind between the notion that everything that's hygienic has to be white. So he has this iridescent auto paint actually from a kind of custom company in detail in downtown LA. Keep going, Zeina.
I just want to add that the sink also was a silica kind of ceramic sand print, and so the sink had a thermal mass property as well. So a lot of our interest in also the kind of thermal qualities of these thick surfaces we began to test out in this case in a fixture or a furniture set of a bathroom. And the tiles were also reinforced concrete as well, with these thermal kind of layers inside, also these heat mats. I'm sorry. Sorry, John, go ahead.
These are some detailed photos, and so this was our first. This is a kind of like project that maybe started to bridge between, on the one hand, like ideas about digital solidity, and on the other hand, a kind of introducing some kind of looseness into the arrangement, the way in which it might appear that this arrangement is somewhat ad hoc or placed during the sort of staging of the exhibition, but actually because of the angles of incidence of not only the floor tiles, but also the way in which they tuck under the basin and the weight of everything, this arrangement, it quite directly corresponds to its own 3D model, its own three-dimensional model. And so in other words, it had to be placed exactly like this in order for it to not sort of spin out of control into a mess. You're seeing it here at the final show. There's some great pieces by colleagues of ours. You see Soil up above us, and Moss and Leong down below, Anna Jaworska and others, and Norman Kelly.
So the next project is not a project per se. We were invited in Milano at the Milano di Triennale to essentially the prompt was how can you present work from your office and essentially bring it within one suitcase. So the work had to kind of fit in one suitcase, and we had this sort of agency to present the kind of ethos of our work and the nature of what we are working at the moment within this space. The exhibition was a moving exhibition, so these tables were arranged throughout the kind of curvature of the space, and the seats that you see to the right basically could be reconfigurable, and also they moved throughout the day. So of course, some of the questions of looseness that John talked about, the kind of precision of looseness and how do you calibrate it computationally, was on our minds. And so we began to think about how we might take a series of objects that we've already produced, which was part of the prompt, and begin to arrange them in a way that produces loose associations that we had not thought about. And we began to test out these loose sort of organizations with different objects that we had in the office, from models, physical models, to fabric experiments, to or garment experiments, to books, posters, all kinds of elements that are basically floating in our space. And here you're starting to see some of the initial tests. Maybe you might recognize some of the models. So we tested them orthographically, and we also tested them in various animations. And we began to kind of exaggerate the sort of distribution of the objects as a way to understand like what kinds of unexpected associations we can make. So here you're seeing a still. You're seeing some of the bathing again models, some posters, and a garment that we had been working on at the time. And this is, the setup. Essentially, we were asked to kind of perform and unravel the exhibition in real time from the suitcase, and we attempted to basically recreate as precisely as possible the organization that we had tested computationally. And here are some stills from the exhibition. So some of these ideas you'll see will continue in the Taipei Biennial project. John, do you want to take this on?
Yeah, so the Triennale project was important, I think, for us because it was so small. It allowed us to kind of like think through some issues that then we were able to work on at a somewhat larger scale. So the Taipei Biennials, it was actually meant to be the second of two shows that was curated by Bruno Latour. The first was at ZKM in Karlsruhe in May of 2020. That, of course, the show in May of 2020, we were originally meant to be part of, but it had to be drastically pared down and mostly limited to European contributors because of the pandemic. By the time we arrived at the end of last year, so the biennial opened in, I think, November, Zeina, of 2020.
No, it opened in December.
In December, yeah.
Basically almost January 1st of
Right.
21.
Almost at the end of the year. So, Taiwan had done a really an amazing job of containing the pandemic locally, at least. And so we were now able to show this work as a physical installation at the Taipei Museum of Fine Arts. So for this project, we collaborated with Kiel Mo, who has done some work recently unpacking the kind of the sort of extractive and logistical origins of specific architectural projects, in particular the Empire State Building, and then in this collaboration, the Seagram Building in New York. So when Bruno sort of approached us a couple of years ago, he was really interested in this idea. I don't know if you're familiar with his recent work, that many of us don't live on the same planet. In fact, he's identified what he thinks are 8 different planets that people live on right now. And some people live in one of them and some people live in another. If you're part of the 1%, you live in Planet Escape and you have your escape plan, if you, et cetera, et cetera. But in each of these planets have kind of different carbon realities. And so what he sees going on in the world right now is a kind of contest between different planetary models, against the background of which, of course, is what he calls the critical zone, which is this very thin film that we all rely on. It's, it goes a few hundred meters deep, and it goes a couple miles into the sky, and that's about what we can rely on. So he wanted us to really try to visualize and almost in a really, because it's a public exhibition, it's not an architectural exhibition, it's a public exhibition. So he wanted us to really try to make visible this notion, the idea of how much materiality and energy is required to just assemble a single architectural object. And of course, Kiel's work picking these canonical objects. So we immediately contacted him and said, we want to collaborate with you and find a vehicle for showing this very interesting research. Here you're seeing just a lot of images of the way Seagram was made. I mean, it's, looking into the processes of materialization and these tremendous amounts of kind of like carbon expenditure that go into producing a single architectural object. The looking into the quarries and where does all the marble come from, where do the fabrics come from, and doing a kind of like highly quantified analysis of what it really means to not just assemble a building, but then as you get into the archive of the project, looking into all of the documentation that's required, all the legal documentation and the contracts for maintaining the building, down to the precise kinds of lubricants that must be applied to different hinges and doors, and how often different kinds of things have to be oiled in order to be maintained. So it's this kind of huge geological petrochemical undertaking to realize a building. And we wanted to show that in a way that was, on the one hand, was Seagram and was somehow familiar, but was also sort of like immediately defamiliarizing and almost alienating to see this other reality of the Seagram building, aside from this sort of iconic one we all know from photographs. So yeah, keep going, Zeina.
So when we began our collaboration with Kiel, one of the things that he basically approached us with is that he wanted to divide that body of research into three categories, three material categories, which was glass, bronze, and stone. And so, as you know, this was essentially kind of the only prompt that is based on his current book, actually, that just came out called Unless, by Kilmo. And so we began to look at all of these materials, these original materials and material samples that begin to sort of show us how the Seagram building is built out of these three categories. And we looked and researched and looked into originals, original brown samples, original granite. This is the pink granite to the right, the green marble, etc. And to the point where we had to also look into the chemicals that went into the sort of silica making of the glass. And as John was saying, we collected different maintenance documents that Mies and his office actually had to draft up for the client and in order for the building not just to be built as anticipated and imagined, but also for the building to live a longer life with full maintenance. And you start to realize that actually the amount of labor that goes into the maintenance and even the cleaning of the building post its construction goes well beyond even the construction documents of its construction process.
We sort of set on this phrase we called soft mies in the office, where we started to wonder if we printed a lot of the documentation on softer fabrics and canvases, maybe that would help to sort of like defamiliarize it. It's okay, Zeina, you can put it on the animation. And then again, because it was sort of it's been in the office around the same time as some of these other more recent projects, just imagining what it would mean to sort of not dematerialize Seagram. We don't want to dematerialize it. We want to rematerialize it in a way that's unfamiliar, or that you have to do some work to connect up, that the viewer would have to do some work to connect up the reality that they're going to see at the biennial with the kind of iconic image of Seagram. So you're seeing a lot of the fabrics, the curtains, the leathers that go into the furniture, all being played out here. Go ahead. Some stills from a lot of those those sort of gravity animations. What you're seeing in the background is this kind of set of this. So there would be two surfaces. We decided there'd be a horizontal surface and a vertical surface. The vertical surface would be all dynamic, immersive imagery, historical imagery, cartographic imagery. We worked with Peter Osborne, who's also, I mean, he's worked with us in the past, but he helped produce the kind of film for this. Here you're seeing some of the orthographics that were used, that were extracted from those animations to lay out in a very kind of like Saul LeWitt precision where things would go. Of course, we're in this moment now where we're not able to be on site during construction at all. And so we're trying to give as precise instructions as possible to the curatorial team about the placement of everything. Keep going. Those were set against these kind of purposefully oversized sort of set of tables that have a kind of tectonic character to them, I guess, in a way, a kind of geologic content in a way, but not.
We began to call them apparent solids in the office. And one of the things that we were really interested in is how do we translate some of our, early interests in computational solids that actually had to, not only were extremely heavy, like the 800-pound sink, for example, but also that necessitated methods of construction that were either automated or that are far more complex and expensive. So one of the things we were really interested in here is how do we begin to experiment with very similar approaches to formal, explorations, but turn these objects into part solids and part thin, let's say part thick and part thin. And that's why we started to refer to them as apparent solids.
This is just, these are images during installation. Keep going, Zeina.
Sorry guys, it's stuck for a second. I will reshare.
Yeah, details now from the installation. We had this kind of like joinery details.
So we developed 3 what we called modules that can be repeated 3 times in different orientations. And the idea is that they can be reconfigured also in different ways. So here are some of the details of how they come together. And this was in the end the final configuration, but each of these modules, there are 3 of them, can be arranged in different orientations and in different angles. And here you're seeing what John was talking about, which is the kind of vertical dynamic surface against the horizontal curatorial static surface. We like this image of, I think that day there was some groups of students, elementary students who came in for a visit.
Okay, we got 2 more to get through, so.
So this last project before we move on to the Everson Museum is a recent store that we designed 2 years ago, almost called the Jack Irwin flagship store. So it's basically their first retail, sort of physical retail space in general, and they've chosen to locate it on Madison Avenue in New York City. The space was about 1,500 square feet. We were already interested in ideas around optimality and opticality and materiality, but also the kind of intense contrast between oversaturation and desaturation in a lot of our work. We are also interested in ideas of immersion and producing sort of specific scenes within the space.
I'd say around this time we've really, for a number of years now, we've been sort of thinking about obviously the different kinds of characteristics that we all use in our image making and wondering how some of that might make its way into physical space in different ways. In this case, thinking about a kind of, how could we have an approach that somehow has depth to it, but also has a lot of the kind of superficial qualities that we would more readily associate with images.
The space was also meant to be used for events, not just a display of their the product. So they make different types of booths and such, but they were also interested in having the space be cleared out for events and openings. And so we configured a stage in the middle, and we kind of conceived of it as being able to be used for these different purposes. And these sort of display cubes were also can be rearranged in different ways. here you're seeing the desk in the back, which we refer to as the wrapping desk, against a aluminum wall system. We use this wall as a way to also separate between the back of house and the front of house of the store. And the last project will be the Everson Museum.
So it's hard to condense this down into a very brief set of slides, but we'll try to do our best to describe the breadth of the project. And I say that partly because there was a lot in the project to begin with, and then a lot of it has changed during COVID. We've had to rearrange the priorities and the phasing of things. So the project was, as Zeina, or as Stephen mentioned during the introduction, was two-part. It's a two-phase international competition. The second phase was with 4 teams, and our proposal was selected. It involved, on its face, at the sort of superficial level of PR announcements, it's effectively to design a new sort of restaurant cafe for the Everson Museum. We realized very quickly as we got into the second stage that there was actually quite a bit more to it than that. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is one of IMP's sort of earliest standalone cultural projects. It's one of his earliest museums. It was designed in the late 50s and early 60s and ultimately opened in the mid 60s. You're seeing some iconic images from it here. Just for those who are not familiar with the plans or the project itself. So sort of I'm starting now from the top down, just because our work is on the lower levels. So these are the upper level galleries, which are those large cantilevering masses you see in the photographs. And you can see the central atrium stair, the concrete stair there in the middle. This is the main plaza level plan, the street level plan. So you can see the main atrium again with the spiral stair. The auditorium is off to the left on the west. The auditorium, much of the Everson Museum is actually submerged mostly below ground, roughly between 70 and 80% below ground. So the auditorium is about 70% below ground with a clear story. The east wing that we're working on is the whole section to the right. And this is below ground. So you can see, if you contrast, go back one, Zeina. If you contrast this plan with the next one, how much of the museum is actually underground, and most of its back of house is underground. And we'll talk about why that's been relevant in a minute. Go ahead. So we're concentrated here on the east wing, which is roughly the right half of this slide, of this image. It changes a bit from the upstairs and the downstairs. Go ahead.
Maybe I should add that initially the scope was to focus on the upstairs, but since then the scope has expanded, and so now we're basically reworking the east wing upstairs and downstairs.
Yeah, and I would say probably, I mean, we know now in hindsight, part of the reason we were selected is that we exceeded the competition brief, and we actually proposed much more than just a cafe. We proposed a kind of reworking of the east wing and making a large portion of the back of house public, which we'll show in a moment.
The cafe actually, so maybe just to clarify also, the east wing is not accessible to the public, which is why what we propose is to basically reroute the circulation so that public can have access to this side of the museum.
For my personal collection, I'm not thinking about it. I have a collection of functional art. It is, those pots, when they are not in use, are just sleeping. Their information that they give out is when somebody collaborates with each piece individually. So I would hate to see the bulk of it end up in a museum where it can only be looked at and rarely touched. So I have some kind of fantasy where some curator might pick a couple of pieces that are for some reason more important. I can't imagine what those would be, but I would make that offer. And then everything else would go to a restaurant, and that it would be used until it's all broken except for the last piece. And then the last piece with a story of the Rosenfield collection could go somewhere to some archive or some historical place.
So this is what we learned in the second phase of the competition, is that the impetus for the new project was that Louise Rosenfield, whose voice you just heard, had offered to donate to Everson, which had always been a very important ceramics museum from its inception, offered to donate her roughly 3,000 piece collection of functionalist ceramics, meaning all of her pieces, no matter how abstract they look, they were made with some function in mind. And on her view, ceramics as an art form, unlike many other art forms, it simply cannot be understood. You cannot understand its cultural value, its meaning, if you don't hold it and touch it and use it for what it was meant for, which was to eat out of or drink out of or something like that. So she made this, she was willing to donate her collection and some money. And her only stipulation is what you just heard in that podcast that our research team unearthed from several years ago during our competition phase, which was that the only rule was that all of her collection had to be used by the public in this restaurant in some way or another, and that she was well aware that over time, likely all of her collection would break. Any of you who have worked in restaurants know that people drop things daily. And so that really got us fascinated during the second. We wanted to really understand why she felt this way, and how could that become this kind of much more than just a restaurant, but a kind of radical transformation of the brief as we were given it. So two big considerations for us. One is, and we'll try to speed up here because we're running out of time, but if you look at the history of the public museum, of course, and I'm speaking in very broad strokes here, but in some ways we can see it as having emerged out of the private cabinet of curiosities, which is to say that in the private cabinet of curiosities, there was no back of house and front of house because it was a private collection and only those who knew the owner were able to come and view the collection. With the emergence of the museum as a public institution, you suddenly have rooms like this famous image from the Met, in which the public is never meant to see the art in this form. It simply becomes a way of efficiently and carefully preserving and storing and maintaining and repairing the collection. And so that line held pretty firmly until relatively recently, as museums have had to compete with the experience economy over the past few decades. We're beginning to see museums that are willing to break down that firm line of visibility between back of house and front of house. And of course, all of you, I'm sure, have been over to the Broad, where you see the window onto the vault. Now, of course, we interviewed the woman who runs the vault as part of our research, and she said we don't actually do any real preserving in that space because she was terrified that one of her staff members might accidentally shove an X-Acto blade through a famous painting, and that window has someone Instagramming in it constantly. And so that incident would occur. So this becomes this kind of weird third space, which is meant to represent the back of house. It's not the real back of house. It's this kind of other kind of almost a performance space in a way. This is so that's the first part, is this back of house, front of house issue. The second part was this image, which was very crucial for us, which is, this is what the space is like without artificial lighting. Meaning that the zone we were given to work with has very poor natural lighting. It was not ever designed to be a gallery or a restaurant. It was meant to be a kind of like cloistered members lounge, but it certainly wasn't meant to have the kind of daylighting that you might want for a new project. So these two things together, we called this the chiaroscuro effect, this kind of intense, bright sunlight that comes in, but immediately gets sucked into the concrete and absorbed into the concrete and gives these deep regions of darkness. Yeah, I mean, associated, of course, with Caravaggio. And keep going, Zeina. So the same kind of like massing that gives Everson its iconic character also leads to this chiaroscuro effect, where you have this really, for galleries, again, it's not a problem. You want controlled light, but for the kind of project we're trying to produce, it was an issue. This is the space as we received it, meaning a year and a half or more ago now. It had a kind of like defunct lounge in the upper level. And this is what Zeina meant earlier. This space was always totally schizophrenic and confused about whether it was back of house or front of house. So the upstairs is front of house, meaning it was a kind of lounge. And then where this photograph is being taken from is a gallery. But the downstairs was all staff area and off access, meaning the public was not allowed in there. So on the one hand, you had restricted access, but you had complete acoustic commingling and visual commingling. Keep going.
So in the first phase of the project, we proposed an image like this, of course, very preliminary, in which we began to think about a couple different things. So on the one hand, the back of house collapsing with the front of house, and then on the other hand, finding ways in which we can increase and exaggerate the light condition in the space and really brighten it, because that's a major issue in the space. So how do we begin to collapse different sort of surfaces in their materialities in the way that they could become reflective and really like bring in light from the skylights. So we began to conceive of a family of elements that could serve as what we called curatorial surfaces, both horizontal and vertical. And what we propose is, again, a kind of loose assemblage of discrete elements, which provide flexible surfaces for curation, but also communality. Today, we'll focus on one aspect. There are many different kind of, let's say, chapters in the project. So we'll just focus on the what we call the curatorial towers, which we also refer to as the prismatic towers in the office, because they are meant to be, on the one hand, display cases, but on the other hand, they're also meant to bring in and exaggerate and really reflect more natural light into the space.
They're also meant to be these kind of elements that are neither front of house nor back of house, but are something completely new, meaning on the one hand, they display ceramics. On the other hand, they're also storage. We calculated exactly how much more additional storage our proposal would offer the museum. Every museum has a storage issue right now. 95% of its collection is off-site, and they're paying for that. And ceramics, like sculpture, are some of the most space-intensive things to store. So it was also, and it really increases the amount of the collection that's on view to the public.
And we saw this this tower as doing what John was saying, but also the visitors could actually be able to have access to the ceramics and be able to take them and use them if needed. Now, of course, we're rethinking the kind of operation of the restaurant post-COVID, but the idea remains the same. And the towers were meant to also be basically inserted into these sort of empty spaces between the piers. So you're seeing here the skylights that were originally conceived. These towers that we were imagining as being there but not there would also have a very kind of a clear role where we would sort of suck the light from the skylight and literally like reflected back into the spaces above and below. So we began to research, and we spoke with a glass consultant, James Carpenter, and began to research different materials, both sort of mirror-like, almost like aluminum materials, but also cast glass that have prismatic properties. So here you're seeing the space as we conceived it, in which you would have these large sort of towers that are basically storage, but also prismatic machines. And you see how the space above becomes the restaurant and the gallery floor, and the space below, which is now part of the scope of our project. It did not used to be. What we are doing is we are reimagining this area as a kind of library, but also conference area, and visitors or public can also have access to the library occasionally, and they can have access to the atrium when there are specific openings or events in the atrium space. this is the other view towards the hallway that leads to the curator's offices and the director's office.
We'll show in a moment that our only physical intervention, our only modification of these existing building during our proposal was the removal of the back of house door. So the public will have access to this whole courtyard, this double height, this sort of beautiful double height space now. That's the new research library, looking into it. So just to sort of like begin to conclude here, we've spent the vast majority of the time so far dealing with waterproofing issues, which come from the fact that the museum is basically submerged halfway underground. And so really from beginning last summer, there was a lot of conservation and restoration work around the expansion joints and the concrete to begin to try to figure out a lot of the water issues over the years. And a tremendous amount of money has gone into that, which is not even the original project we were brought on for, but it's been incredibly exciting. And we've been able to do a lot of research on there's lots of different pigments in the concrete that come from the different quarries from which it was sourced. This is all exterior stuff. So this is, here's a couple, like this is before, and then this is where we are right now. So where we are right now is pulling, we're in full demo right now, and we're just trying to get everything down to the kind of raw concrete and polish it and restore it. This is before, and this is almost now. I mean, you'll see in a minute, we've also demoed the ceilings at this point, but this will be the restaurant, the cafe portion.
We removed all carpets.
Into it, seasonal.
We removed all carpets and any kind of sheetrock that was added that was not original. And we're slowly now starting to demolish the ceiling.
This is the back, this is the main ceramics gallery downstairs, and we proposed to eliminate that door that you're looking at, and they agreed. In our competition entry, we proposed that, and they liked that idea. So as you'll see in a moment, that door has not yet been removed because it's kind of the last thing we'll demo before we open it up to the public. But this is what used to be behind that door, a kind of like somewhat disheveled staff area. That's what it looks like now, and it will become a new, what the director is calling a new jewel box gallery for the Ceramic Nationals, which is a very famous ceramic competition. Everson holds a lot of the collection of the Ceramic Nationals. So this will become this kind of sub gallery off the main ceramics gallery. And then you're looking off in the distance at the research library that will be reconfigured.
One of the things that we're also doing is rewriting all the electrical. There's all kinds of like knickknacks on the walls and things that we're trying to completely clean up. This is looking from the library.
From that to the back of house door, that'll all be gone.
And we still have not removed the door, but we're starting to clean up. We need to basically restore all the concrete and refinish it and clean it. And this is a kind of sneak peek in some ways on what would happen once you get rid of this door.
Let's just run through the last few, Zeina, and then.
We're still removing some of the carpets downstairs. This was a really amazing kind of, as an anecdote, realization that everything is perfectly straight. This never happened in any restoration project we've ever experienced. And we will end with the most current condition. We have now removed all the ceiling panels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe we can, oh, that's a nice image to end on actually, but maybe unshare.
Should I stop sharing, Stephen?
Yeah, let's stop sharing and then we'll kind of launch into a Q&A for a little bit here. First of all, thank you for your lecture and congratulations on your work. It's really starting to get going to something exciting. I also really want to, thank you for the way in which you analyze, articulate, and have committed to research in not only just your work, but also the way in which you went after the competition was very impressive. The way you're starting to talk about it. I do have a couple questions that maybe you could elaborate on. Um, I'd love you to talk more about loose collectivity and how that has meaning in your work, not only on a physical level, but maybe on an intellectual, socio-political level. But I also really would love to know more about your use of color. Um, you know, there seems to be something really interesting the way it began with, or didn't, the way you presented it, it began sort of with these thermometrics and the beautiful drawings that you put together, studying, I guess, thin and thick and thermal characteristics, but seems to have evolved. You call it prismatic, but arguably they're not really prism colors. They're far more sophisticated and very specific, and I wouldn't call them postmodern. You're up to something else, and they have a contemporaneity to it that's very actually unique. So maybe you can elaborate a little.
I mean, I think I'll let Zeina take on the color question because it's something she's, you know, maybe tried to articulate it to the extent that we're even able to. I mean, I think some of those issues are really intuitive, and there are things that we I would say that, like, Zeina and I from the beginning, just at an almost like pre-discursive level, have sort of just agreed on that color would be a project or a part of our project always. But to your first question, Stephen, I think yeah, there are kind of like political dimensions or inflections to that question. I think it's a lowercase p in a way. That is to say, what would be within the politics of everyday life? I mean, what is the what agency, what ability do we have as architects in this moment where there's these kinds of overwhelming global catastrophic issues that we want to somehow still keep working and participate in culture, but at the same time we want to do it differently than maybe it's been done so far. I think in some ways the looseness, in a very practical sense, is maybe a reaction to just emerging suites of digital tools and tendencies and things that seem to be endemic to this to computational techniques that are necessarily growing and that we're importing from other fields of you know, from outside the field of architecture, which allow us to experiment with different kinds of digital relationships. I think the question that you're aiming at maybe has more to do with how does that relate to any kind of like sociopolitics of the work. And it's kind of been there from the beginning, that how would we, if we are going to, how could we draw things together, so, you know, not just sort of subjects and objects, but whole collections of things that don't fall into all the typical categories that maybe we've conventionally sort of broken them into. And how would we do that in such a way that's not nostalgic? How would we all have tendencies, I think, in contemporary life towards isolation, whether it's spatial isolation or auditory isolation, and to some extent we desire that at certain points of the day. So given that tendency within sort of neoliberal subjects to wish to be alone, what would it mean to collect these things in a sort of looser manner? And are there spatial and material approaches that can ask that question more softly in a way? Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think I'll let Zeina answer the other one.
I mean, maybe as a transition, I would say that there's maybe a whole body of work that we did not show today that I'm sure many of you are familiar with around images and imaging in general, that we chose today not to show. But of course, you know, our work in part is simply about understanding how to become literate in new media. This is something we're really interested in, but without having, let's say, software or hardware platforms like shape how we think, or which of course they do inevitably, but we're interested in kind of challenging the workflows of these tools in some ways, and not about mastering them, but rather about destabilizing them and kind of hybridizing them in ways that are unexpected. And for us, these are kind of like ongoing questions, you know, try to understand the consequences for architecture in this way. So in some ways, I think the looseness around ideas of collectivity and the looseness of the collections of objects and the looseness of also some of these techniques that you saw are all interrelated, whether directly or indirectly. And it's just kind of floating in the back of our minds as we work. As for the question of color, I mean, the work that John is referring to that I had been doing for a while around computational color actually emerged not from color itself, or let's say the traditions of color theory, but rather emerged from questions of early experimentations with color signals. So in a recent piece that I wrote for eFlux, Notes on Making Images with Computers, I mostly focused on a kind of brief history of artists in the early 60s and 70s who began to really manipulate the signal of televisions, but mostly to produce and to synthesize video as a way to produce abstract shapes and visual effects and color effects. So in some ways, I think effects is an interesting term that, let's say, as a kind of umbrella for some of our approaches to color. But what was really interesting for us is how color posed a kind of particular set of problems and opportunities within the medium of the CRTV. So colorization became very fascinating precisely because it was mysterious at the time. And of course, people like Mary Ellen Butte, who's really kind of the pioneer of video experiments in 1940s, really early experimentation, is someone I really look to for a lot of my work. So it's a kind of longer conversation, but I think colors for us is more about a spectrum of sort of video effects, and maybe color is not such a static dimension of, but rather of a proliferation of effects in which images are created. And so in some ways there are work around how do we work with images, and how do we use images, and what does that mean to experiment with images is also related to our approach to color. Maybe to answer your question more directly, it's very hard for us in some ways. We get this asked a lot. There's not a rationale behind the choices of specific colors. I think it just is sort of part of a general process and our fascination with saturation in general.
Thank you for that. You know, even not to go back to politics or even any kind of hidden subtext, you do talk about the Romplan a lot, which brings us to a discussion of Adaflos if we wanted to. But what I loved is then you hit on white and hygiene, which we know is just such a very strange, problematic, historical. It exceeds modernism, but it certainly was part of the modern project. And then to make it iridescent was a strategy. And it wasn't a strategy devoid of an intention. I think you're very smart with those choices. Maybe we just don't really know how to say what that might mean or why we're doing what we're doing, but I do applaud the effort. There's some questions, actually. Maybe we go right to the other hygiene question by Robert. I'm gonna try to find Robert, or actually, Kate, maybe you have your question. You're right here on the panel. Do you wanna just ask?
Sure. So my question was, and I sent it in the chat if you need to see it, but it just said, so by using gravity studies in various animation and digital practices in the preliminary phases of your design, do you experience a disconnect between the inherent movement or looseness that is initially produced that cannot be actualized in the final realization of these projects and exhibits? I'm just kind of interested in that, and maybe if you have had to deal with it.
I mean, for those of you who've worked with gravity engines, no matter how advanced they get, they just are not as precise as we'd like them to be still. You know, whatever software you might end up using, whether it's a video game software like Unity or whether it's Maya or whether other Kangaroo, there's still kind of inherent imprecision within these tools. Now, for us, it's not really a linear process. It's actually more of a feedback loop between the initial collision of all these objects and what they might make, and then going back and recalibrating based on like real parameters that exist in like, you know, reality, like gravity, like additional sets of parameters around gravity, but also material weights and material properties and such. So it's definitely a back and forth, because you can very easily just get trapped into the world of the kind of collision experiment, the digital collision experiment, and never make it out into the world. And I think for us, we're constantly testing between the two.
I mean, also, in an odd way, the conditions actually the opposite of what you're describing, Kate. The animations, no matter how loose they look, are permanently, they're sort of permanently mathematized, meaning you are staring at precision in its sort of like starkest form. What we're actually interested in is the way in which how does the materialization and physicalization of that form of precision, how might it produce forms of sociality around those collections? So, for example, in bathing again, it was fascinating for us to watch at the opening of the gallery show, people trying to navigate around this thing, and what could they step up onto it? Was that permitted or not? If they couldn't step up onto it, how do they step over it? And ultimately, as an actual furniture proposition, to our mind, it produces a much looser relationship among people and objects, between subjects and objects, than the typical sort of like modern bathroom as we all experience it on a day-to-day basis, in which you have a highly rigid relationship between the fixtures, the reflection, and very few social interactions likely. So in a way, I don't think there's any disappointment at all.
Interestingly,
so
actually,
Hmm?
John, I was going to add to that, like in the Taipei biennial, similar effects have been noticed, like by the curator who mentioned to us, Martin Guinat, who mentioned that people were very encouraged to kind of like sift through the documents and walk around and within the kind of sort of openings of the table. And so there's also something about the looseness of the arrangement of the table, but also the looseness of the content on the table that produces like unexpected social sort of interactions, as John was saying. And we really like those. We like the kind of unexpected and how it challenges the use or the kind of compartments around these objects.
Robert, you want to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. It's about your designs of social areas. I was wondering how have they been affected by the pandemic with regard to hygiene, and are any of these permanent considerations or changes?
Well, especially in the case of the Everson, what it did is it quite literally reversed the phasing. So if originally the primary goal for the museum was to open the restaurant as quickly as possible, that of course was placed into a second phase, and the first phase became all of the lower areas of opening up the back of house and reconfiguring all the staff areas. To your question, I would say, yes, it has absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, in the case of the Everson project, the mandate of the donor that everyone be able to touch and hold these ceramics, the idea that you could walk into a cafe and pick up 7 different cups and choose that 7th one is the one that you want to use. We're hopeful that we'll get back to a world in which that's actually possible. Until then, we're having to redesign a lot of the display elements in the cafe itself. We're kind of having to design for the moment and for the possible future, the hopeful future, that all of this becomes less of an immediate consideration. But of course, I would think we can all imagine that at least for a few years, it would feel very strange to walk in and touch everyone else's dinnerware. On a very practical level, we're researching all kinds of like quick sanitizing equipment. I mean, it gets very mundane and dull at a certain point, talking about that stuff, but it's, but you know, UV systems for rapid sanitizing. So in a way, that will be something that we continue to work on over the course of this summer. And whether that'll be permanent, I don't know. You know, we don't have a crystal ball, but I can say that we're trying to design it in a way that it could eventually return to that original, that sort of original dream, if and when that time comes.
I mean, to be fair, the previous to the pandemic, there was already conversations about the kind of sanitary practices of this idea, right? So meaning the museum and the donor, Louise Rosenfield, were adamant about the kind of sociality of this dimension of the project and making it happen. But there was already questions about how do you sanitize, and when a person picks a ceramics piece and goes to actually like get a meal or a tea or something out of the ceramic piece. So there was already kind of the beginning of thinking in this way. And now, of course, because it was on hold, we had to think how to change it more drastically. But actually, as the vaccinations have begun, the director and the donor are interested in going back to a kind of middle zone where we can still implement these ideas while having them be, you know, sanitary.
Jose, you have a question, and then Jimenez.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, one kind of aspect of your process I kind of admired was how you have this incredibly relevant bridge between your research and how you end up framing your proposals. But the way that you kind of broke them down didn't exactly seem so linear, but it kind of always had this influx of different, for example, like the inclusion of like chiaroscuro as an art form, or the cultural use of the bath kind of changing over time. And I'm kind of curious how you frame your research, that it kind of has, you've been able to leverage it in such an effective way.
I mean, this term is so overused in a way, right? We don't think of what we're doing really as research. I mean, I think maybe in a very limited way, sometimes you're like, if you're writing a piece or something, you might do a bit of actual research in the kind of like scholarly sense. But that's I think in our work, we weren't sure how else to put it. I mean, like, you know, we love Moss's office statement about how much they hate office statements. At the same time, at some point we wanted to articulate to ourselves even something. And so the closest we've come is that just looking at how, we wrote that years after we'd been working together, and we just said, there's something about the way we work that insists on a kind of parallel project of just looking at the world carefully. And in that sense, I don't think we're a lot different than a lot of other practices and architects. Maybe we do it differently because we're in a different time period, but you know, Denise Scott Brown, when she decides to go to Las Vegas, you know, is looking at the world very carefully. Is that research? I don't know. We get down into semantics at a certain point. But I think the one thing you said that is absolutely true is there's nothing linear about it. There's all kinds of things we unearth along the way in projects that you'll never see, that we thought were fascinating and important at a certain moment, and then they go away and they end up in a tucked away in a drawer somewhere, and we find them 3 years later. So I think it's just constantly being curious and engaging and looking at the world as carefully as possible. And I think there's something about the way that you look after being trained as an architect. I think you do look at the world in a different way. And I don't know that we would call the way we look at the world research in the same way an historian might say that, but it drags in different elements of searching and archiving and collecting and investigating, and it's sort of all those things in a way. And there's not any there's not any linear connection between them at all. They'll be there. If you do that, they'll be there. They're still in your brain.
there's probably a history to the method in which you employ, which probably could be unraveled a little bit, which also has to do with how we're educated as architects. I think it's also very interesting the way in which you, and you're not the first to find the word research challenging and problematic to be associated with what we might or might not do. Probably about 10 years ago, it was equated somehow with science, which it isn't. But so it's interesting to see, like, it's like there was a point in history where theory was a dirty word, and now I think it's not anymore, but it was for a good decade. So we just called ourselves historians. Anyway, Jimenez, you want to ask your question?
Hey, sure. Hi, Zeina. Hey, John.
Hey, yes, how are you?
Long time listener, first time
Yeah.
caller. Love your work. Really love the evolution. Just today's talk was really fantastic, both of you. I just I can. No, I'm going to stop praising you guys. I'm just really awestruck. But I have more of an observation than a question. I mean, I'm just gonna, but it might turn into a question. So early on your work, I think maybe all the way back to the Giant Jai Gallery. Let's call it sculpture, for lack of better words, right? There was almost this kind of jagged edge condition that feels like fluting, but not exactly fluting. But then in some other later projects, it actually turns into fluting, right? Like I think a similar operation feels even more like fluting. But this kind of jagged edge, when translated in other ways of reading it, like once we translate it into non-material, non-solid states in other media that you guys deploy, there's a constant, maybe like glitch, or again, the word solid was even used quite a few times by the two of you. It's so, and this kind of jagged fuzz, almost like a material break line of sorts. It's not exactly a question of a high or low resolution either, even it could be taken that way. It's more, but to me, it more feels like a materialization of a constant state of instability, like a perpetual agitation, like some type of fidgeting that turns into, again, you keep using the word fuzz, and I think this thing that I'm observing is hinted at in both of your writings, but I just wonder if this is something that you talk about, this kind of fuzz or agitation where
Yeah.
It's so funny you say this because actually the rooftop project, the ceiling curvature, initially we were really interested in like a very smooth surface, and then when we began to experiment with the CNC 4-axis wire cutter, there was literally a glitch that happened in the G code that we were feeding to the machine, and it got stuck, and it kept ruining the curvature and creating these like additional lines or ruled surfaces, and it's a literal accident that we just like we got really excited about. We're like, oh, this is so much better than we would have even like conceived of initially in our kind of Rhino experiments, right? As we were testing these ruled surfaces and lofting and such. So this is just an anecdote, but a lot of the time we definitely embrace accidents, and we kind of encourage them in the process of our work.
Yeah, I think also, yeah, thanks very much, Jimenez, for the comments and the question, or comment as a question. I think also, I'm sure you can sympathize with this, is that we were so sort of like bludgeoned during our educations with the sort of machismo of digitality, of look at how amazingly precise and complex this can all be, and isn't that fantastic and shiny and fabulous. And I think, of course, we have a tremendous respect for the accomplishments of that sort of, what Carpa would call the first digital, generation or age, right? And we're not trying to be critical in any way. We're just saying we're much more fascinated by the errors that are endemic in the digital. The digital can be very precise. It's also incredibly prone to error. And isn't that also equally interesting? You know, like what Zeina just described was a miscommunication between the heat settings and the G code. And these kinds of very simple, like what you're calling a fuzziness, electricity contains, the signalization of electricity contains error, it's error prone. And it actually takes a tremendous amount of work to make it not produce error. We're much more interested in how do we gain, as Zeina said at one point, how do we gain like literacy in that field of error that mostly has wanted to present itself as glossy precision, because that's the rhetoric of Silicon Valley is proprietary software, capital intensive technologies, isn't the world going to be better, TED Talk. And we're just kind of bored and grossed out by that language, that it still persists in our time. And why can't we have an approach? Why can't we just admit that our digital tools are full of pathologies? They're pathological. I mean, it's like if you read Orit Halpern's work on beautiful data, she literally diagnoses that cybernetic, that neural nets are they're pathological. They don't have a history. They don't think historically. So I think like there's a whole other conversation there about like we're both trained as musicians, and I think like there's always a question in music between the kind of analog and the electrical, and what kind of feedback, what kinds of things you produce from feedback that you can't produce with an analog instrument. And so I think a lot of that early on for us was part of the conversation. But yeah, whether you call it fuzz or glitch or whatever, it's there. It's in our it's embedded in our cultures, and so why not take it up as a kind of architectural project?
Yeah, I don't mean to take more time, but this is so interesting to hear your response. Maybe we can even tie it back to the earlier color question. You know, when chips fall where they may, you know, when we allow a certain room, or maybe even design for a room for kind of, you know, accidents to happen or anticipate for that space. You know, like the thing about reactions between material and light is that almost always we get a spectrum of a rainbow of sorts, you know, and this is happening a lot in your work. And I'm sorry, I mean, from your response, and I just get this feeling when chips fall where they may, we get rainbows.
Well, the old sort of freshman philosophy paradox of is your green my green becomes this totally different thing in RGB life, in screen life, because I literally don't know if your green is my green at an even technical level. And so why not just sort of wade around in that uncertainty rather than continuously try to produce further definitions of certainty.
Joseph, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I wanted to
make this the last one.
sort of ask John if this was the analogy that you're drawing to music. So is it that you're really embracing sort of the harmonic distortion of a vacuum tube, that analog warm fuzzy, for use of the word fuzzy again, into the digital realm of what you're designing?
Well, I'm certainly like the piece that Zeina referenced earlier, some of her research into computational color does get into, well, I don't know, Zeina, do you want to, the sort of time period in which things were not only not proprietary, but the artist literally had to collaborate with the engineer to just even get a picture on the television to emerge. So it's almost pre-software. And so in that case, certainly, you know, the kind of vacuum tube, I mean, obviously we're far beyond that at this point. I think it's just an allusion to, like I was saying earlier, I think there's a whole set of engineering values around optimization, precision, you use harmony, I mean, performance, efficiency. These are perfectly fine values. I mean, there's nothing wrong with them, but we also shouldn't just swallow them by way of our software and our hardware, because maybe a lot of the best architecture historically has been produced by experimentation and accident and error. In the age of orthography, that always played out on paper. In our case now, we're trying to open up the screen to those same questions of why would you want to know exactly what comes out when you hit print? I guess that's one question we want to know. Why is that so interesting? You know, but of course, you move then into the construction realm where your client would be deeply disappointed if what if what you drawn out didn't come out. So we have to always be balancing all of that.
Clients, ironically, don't always know what you're drawing and what you're modeling, and they kind of often pretend they do. There's something there that is unraveled or has to be unraveled at some point. What you think it's going to look like and what they think it's going to look like is probably not always the same thing.
Right.
And I guess it gets back to your green question too. My green's not your green, and my screen's not your screen. I don't know what I'm going to look like each time I come onto this screen. Anyway, this is a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. It's been great to get you in here, and I appreciated all the questions. And I think we're going to wrap it up, although there was another question that just came in. I don't know, Jesse, are you okay if we just, can you guys read that in the Q&A? I think that's a bit of a Jimenez thing here too. But
I just closed it.
I don't see it. Maybe
Yeah.
you can read it to us.
I'm just going to let it go because I have to go. And I just want to say thank everybody. And
yeah, we also just want to say, like, any lectures we're giving this year, like, to the students, hopefully this is all almost over. And I mean, it's really, it's been completely remarkable, like, watching our students get through this. So you know, hopefully it sounds like you guys you have a little ways to go this quarter, but you know, hang in there.
Kudos to you guys. It's difficult.
Yeah, it's a very difficult year. So, but you're almost there.
It's been a tough year. You know, kind of being online is also, these lectures have been fun as a way to gather us together. So thank you for participating and bringing some fun colors and some fuzzy moments into our world. Okay, everyone, have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
It's very strange to look at a checkerboard of
but these are your colors, and you're in the colors. Your room is the same color. It's great.
It's a little disturbing, and I'm somehow coordinated as well, unintentionally. Bye, guys.
Fantastic. Bye, everybody. Good night.